Oklahoma will require applicants for teacher jobs coming from California and New York to pass an exam that the Republican-dominated state's top education official says is designed to safeguard against radical leftist ideology, but which opponents decry as a MAGA loyalty test. I think it's hilarious that they're coming out and making this sort of test to protect against radical leftist ideology, but they wouldn't try and like at least appear to be balanced and say that they're going to protect against radical right-wing ideology, which is arguably more dangerous because more terrorist acts, as far as I understand, happen under extremist right-wing ideology than left-wing ideology. I'm not saying no violent acts happen at all when it comes to extremist left-wing ideology, but my understanding is that statistically more happens under the right wing, yada yada. But it just seems crazy to me that they aren't even giving up the pretext of trying to be balanced here. That it's just, we don't like leftists. Basically, we don't want to keep them. We don't want to let them in. I think it's also funny that this comes from Oklahoma, which I'm pretty sure ranks number 50 of 50 when it comes to a number of education outcomes. So basically, they have the worst schooling system of any state in the entire union. Ryan Walters, Oklahoma's public schools superintendent, said Monday that any teacher coming from the two blue states will be required to pass an assessment exam administered by PragerU. PragerU is the one administering these tests, which is even more bonkers, right? Like, I know that there's been a number of states, including, I think, Oklahoma, that's been using some PragerU like teaching materials and textbooks in their public schools, which is not only crazy, but like they're not a real, as far as I understand, like certified educational outfit. And what I mean by that is like they aren't endorsed by any of the major education organizations out there. I don't think any of them advocate for PragerU, and they very clearly have an ideological bent to them. As long as I am superintendent, Oklahoma classrooms will be safeguarded from the radical leftist ideology fostered in places like California and New York, Walters said in a statement. PragerU, short for Prager University, puts out short videos with a conservative perspective on politics and economics. It promotes itself as focused on changing minds through the creative use of digital media. Yeah, my understanding is they started off just making like these really short form political videos, and they somehow expanded into like a full educational operation, like a faux educational operation, right? Like arguably an indoctrination operation, with the veneer of being education, right? Like if you teach some basic math facts, but then you have a bunch of this ideology stuff hiding in the background when it comes to history and social studies and things like that, right? Does that make you an educational outfit because you have these math facts that you're teaching, that are objective and can't really have an ideological bent to them? Well, okay, you're kind of 50-50, right? You're hiding the ball. Prager didn't immediately respond to a phone message or email seeking comment, but Marissa Straight, CEO of PragerU, told CNN that several questions on the assessment relate to undoing the damage of gender ideology. Now, Prager himself, Dennis Prager, used to like really spearhead all of this with his talk show and appearances, and he actually personally starring in a lot of these short form videos that they use for educational teaching material. But then I believe it was just like a year or two or three ago, he had some sort of an accident, or he had a disease, or I can't remember exactly what happened, but he got paralyzed from the neck down. And ever since then, he's mostly been absent from like the public eye. I think he still does a talk show every now and then. But it's clear that like his capacity to be involved in that sort of a way is clearly diminished, and that other people have, for the most part, taken the helm and taken the ball and run with it. Although I'm sure he still would be involved in the whole process and in detail if he had the ability to. He's an older guy, though, as far as I understand. Said AFT President Randy Weingarten. She was critical of Walters, who pushed for the state's curriculum standards to be revised to include conspiracy theories about the 2020 presidential election. Wow, so this is the first time that I'm hearing about this. Oklahoma education standards say students must identify 2020 election discrepancies, which is absolutely crazy, especially after courts have already proven that there is no legal basis or no evidentiary basis to any of these election fraud claims, right? It says students must identify discrepancies in 2020 election results by looking at graphs and other information, including the sudden halting of ballot counting in select cities and in key battleground states. So that never happened, okay? Whenever these states are getting their ballot information and getting the results in from a number of different counties around a state, or from very large cities that have a whole ton of polling locations, right? They may all get dumped at once, they may all not, but all of these things have been litigated in court and none of them have been proven to be true, right? There's no mechanism for this for which this is to happen. If they're implying that some cities, they were counting the ballots, they got 80% of the way through and it showed that Harris was going to win, but then it showed if they kept counting that last 20% that Trump was going to win, they suddenly just stopped and then threw out those last 20% of the ballots, is absolutely crazy. The security risks of mail-in balloting, which as far as I understand, there is literally none. Election fraud has not been proven to happen on any scale that could influence any election anywhere. And then furthermore, like you'd have to then make the connection that it's connected to mail-in ballots and that's the security and that is the nexus through which all of this is happening, through which election fraud is happening. But first they need to establish that election fraud is happening in the first place, and they have yet to do that. Or at least they haven't established that election fraud is happening on any scale that could influence the elections, right? Of course, if you have tens, hundreds of millions of people going to vote, you're going to have some examples of somebody with like amnesia or memory problems going to vote twice, or maybe they mail in a ballot and then they go vote in person or whatever. Maybe there's even a handful of people that do it on purpose thinking they can get away with it. But like, that's a federal crime that you can get a pretty severe punishment for. And so most people don't want to do that kind of thing. And most people understand that you get one vote, and they have systems in place to ensure that these things do not happen. And so like they've never been proven to happen on any scale that could influence any election. And then of course, if that hasn't been proven, then you can't prove that like mail-in voting is the nexus through which this happens, right? That's crazy. Sudden batch dumps.
They call them dumps, big, massive dumps.
Which is one of those things that like Mike Lindell, the My Pillow guy, repeats, right? That's just one of those, once you actually talk to an election integrity expert or whatever, they can just immediately debunk this very quickly because it's just like conspiracy theory nonsense, right? That doesn't mean anything. An unforeseen record number of voters, which that completely makes sense, right? Trump was an extremely polarizing candidate. So are they implying that like because it was Biden running, that like who would want to go vote for Biden? Oh, how could they possibly have a record number of voters, right? It was mostly a referendum election against Trump. Most of the Democratic Party was not terribly happy that it was Biden in place, but they were very upset and very disgusted by Trump's first administration. So they wanted to come out, and it was a backlash vote against him, not so much because they loved Biden so much or whatever. And the unprecedented contradiction of bellwether county trends. Like I said, all of these individual claims have been taken to court. There was over 60 court cases across the country. Some of them got completely dismissed on merit, on standing, because they didn't have enough evidence to get it past the grand jury. And the ones that did, none of them actually managed to pan out or influence the election results in any way, shape, or form. These new standards will ensure that kids have an accurate and comprehensive view of historical events while also enforcing the values that make our country great. Yeah, make the values that make our country great, like pretending the election was stolen and protecting the guy that like literally tried to coup the government by inserting his own fake slate of electors for a number of different states and calling the Georgia Attorney General being like, hey, you got to find me 13,000 votes or whatever it was.
I only need 11,000 votes. Fellas, I need 11,000 votes. Give me a break. There's nothing wrong with saying that, that you've recalculated.
Absolutely bonkers. I'm just now learning about this, and that doesn't surprise me one bit that Oklahoma, of all places, is the ones doing this. And then I believe this also comes after Oklahoma just struck down a minimum wage ballot referendum that they had in their special election a couple of months ago, and that people were all like, that they thought maybe there was a chance to, but people voted against raising the minimum wage, which is absolutely also hilarious. Teachers are not rushing here from other states to teach. We've got an enormous teacher shortage, and it's not like we have a giant supply of teachers coming in from blue states anyways. It's really funny that they would implement these sort of restrictions and ideology tests at the same time that Oklahoma is like number 50 in education standards in the US, or test scores or whatever. They already have a teacher shortage. It's just cutting off your nose to spite your face. And so we're going to go over some of the questions that are in this test. What is the fundamental biological distinction between males and females? I don't understand how this means anything, okay? First off, the male-female sex spectrum is not a complete binary, okay? It is a spectrum, in fact, and that they use a number of different markers all the way from chromosomes to reproductive anatomy to gametes to primary and secondary sex characteristics to determine like what sex somebody would be, right? And there's a number of different diseases that can cause one or many of these things to be different than what they would otherwise say they are. I mean, like typically males are XY chromosomes and females are XX chromosomes, but that's not always the case. There are people with XY chromosomes that are biologically female in every other way. They have a uterus, they have the ability to have children, and vice versa. There are people with XX chromosomes that have male genitalia that have the ability to impregnate somebody. And so to say that it's chromosomes and reproductive anatomy, while that is like heuristically probably mostly the case, it is not entirely the case. And this is very clearly like an anti-trans type of question. Males and females is a sex term, right? And sex and gender are two different things, like objectively, like scientifically. And so anybody who would put personal preference, which is I think the types of answers that they're trying to screen for, would be wrong because it's not. Now, gender, you could argue, is arguably within the realm of potentially of personal preference, but sex is not. Sex is an objective analysis. How is a child's biological sex typically identified? Yeah, personal feelings would be wrong because biological sex is not gender, right? If this asked how is a child's gender identified, then that would be a different question with different answers, but it's not. They're talking about a sort of more objective analysis that takes into account a suite of different factors, like I said, including chromosomes, gametes, reproductive anatomy, first and secondary sex characteristics, yada, yada, all that kind of stuff. Which chromosome pair determines biological sex in humans? Well, like I said, it's not just chromosomes, okay? That's like a heuristic way of looking at it. And it is a net that will catch most people are going to fit, if you're a male, you're going to have XY. If you're female, you're going to have XX. But that is not a hard and fast rule. There's plenty of diseases that augment that. And to be asking a teacher that kind of question, who teachers are supposed to be the more educated types of people who would potentially understand that it's not a clear black and white answer on this, is hilarious. And also there are other options on this are hilarious. AABB, RH, right? Like anybody who doesn't know this probably shouldn't be a teacher because the answer is obvious. But just the way that this question is phrased is weird. Why is the distinction between male and female considered important in areas like sports and privacy? Well, arguably it is when it comes to like professional or truly competitive level of sports. But like I think probably when it comes to like high school or lower sports, like really it doesn't matter that much. They're mostly out there for socialization. They're mostly out there to get exercise, right? I don't really care too much like about like different levels of ability when it comes to 12-year-olds in sports, right? Like if you have a 12-year-old who claims to be trans, right, which is super, super rare, I don't think it matters at all what their body type are or level of development or anything like that because they're freaking 12. Okay, they're doing these sports activities mostly for socialization purposes, to get a love of athletics, to get healthier, to get outside and get active and do all those kinds of things. 6, should teachers be allowed to express their own political viewpoints in the classroom in order to persuade the students to adopt their viewpoint? Now, I think generally no, and the answer they have for this is D, no, the classroom is not an appropriate venue for political activism, right? I think for the most part that is true. However, I think if you were acting in good faith, and especially if you're in like a social studies class or a histories class or like maybe even like a civics class especially, you should maybe have the ability to talk about like contemporary political ideologies and potentially mention your own. Now, I would argue that most people probably don't have the ability to do so objectively and fairly and in a balanced way. But like if you are self-aware enough to do that kind of thing, I think that would be fine and probably even more educational and healthy. But yeah, I think in general, I would agree that, okay, yeah, no, the classroom is not typically an appropriate place for this sort of thing. Whether they call it political activism or not, it seems a little extreme, but fine. Now, some of these questions are completely innocuous, like how many total U.S. senators are there? Okay, the answer is obviously 100, and that, yeah, if you're a teacher, you probably should be educated enough to know that sort of thing. Now, like if you're a math teacher, you could be I guess it's theoretically possible. You could be the best math teacher in the world and not know anything about politics or civics and not know that there's 100 senators or whatever. But like you should probably know that sort of thing. So a bunch of these questions are pretty innocuous. Like what are the two main parts of U.S. Congress and things like that. 29 is kind of weird. Who was the president during the Great Depression and World War II? Why would you ask this sort of a very specific sort of like political history type of question? I don't think it's to test your political history knowledge. I think this is sort of like a signal that like we're trying to push back against like the Green New Deal. This idea that FDR was a good president that a number of people have been pushing forward over the last however many number of years. That seems to be a more popular sentiment growing on like sort of center left politics in the United States. And that they're trying to imply that FDR was actually a bad president because he was president during the Great Depression and World War II. But even though he was responsible for the New Deal, which is one of the most influential, if not the most influential piece of politics in U.S. history, rather piece of legislation in U.S. history, as well as a number of other things like Social Security and things like that. So yeah, none of these questions are too bad, I guess. This test isn't quite as bad as I thought it would be, especially considering that it's coming from PragerU. I think they could have gotten much more explicitly partisan and ideological when it comes to it, but the phrasing of some of these questions is definitely a little bit sus. It's clear that what they're signaling towards on some of these questions, but for the most part, it's fairly innocuous in that like, most of these questions, 80% of them, I would hope teachers would already know how to answer regardless, and that they probably, even without this test being implemented, they probably would already screen them for these types of things. And also, I don't really understand what they would hope to accomplish this ideological test, right? If they really were trying to screen out radical left-wing ideology, I don't see how any of these questions actually do that. And even if someone was sort of a radical left-wing activist or whatever, they could probably pretty easily identify how the state wants these questions to be answered in order to pass their standards or whatever, like these weirdly worded questions, so that they know like what they're doing with all of this. So it's not very difficult to deduce. And so I don't really understand how this would actually manage to screen out any radical left-wing activists or whatever. And that like they probably could have gone a lot harder on this. They could have gotten a lot more extreme and ideological on this. And this is just kind of a small piece of news that I don't think very many people would have heard about. So they probably could have gotten away with it without much public attention. But instead they went with this, which is fairly innocuous. Like I said, a few questions are kind of weird, but it could be worse. And, most of these questions you should already know the answer to anyways.